things tend to just go round and around and around, right? So what's old is new. Things come and go. They trend, right? So part of the cycle.
Wow.
What's up, everybody? So my name is Michael Stevenson, as some of you probably already know. If you are a fan of the channel or if you have subscribed to the channel, again, thank you for coming back and watching my videos and pretty much watching me ramble through them as I'm trying to get a hold of this whole medium. Again, I'm not used to talking straight directly to the camera, so it's a little strange for me, but here we are. So tonight it's going to probably feel like a bit of a nothing burger of a video, mainly because I don't have one specific thing to pinpoint or to pin down in this video, like a big takeaway, I guess. But it also is an incredibly important video. While it is not necessarily, or at least it probably shouldn't add to our language that we are building here on the channel, it is something that I'm definitely going to come back to multiple times and reference. So basically tonight I wanted to start in on talking about a little bit about writing, and specifically writing techniques. One of the reasons I was compelled somewhat to do these videos is mainly because, being a writer, I started to notice a lot of different things in Hollywood and how they are building stories these days, and I didn't particularly like it. In some ways, a lot of the things that we tend to dislike about movies now, some of the main reasons as to why a lot of our movies are not hitting or landing in the same way or having the same impact as they may have previously had in past generations, is because of the writing. The writing has been subpar for a number of years, whether that is plots or the storyline or the characters or the fact that we don't seem to have quotable lines anymore. There's a lot going on. But what I wanted to do is that I actually wanted to start with sort of advanced principles that most writers, or at least good writers or good writing, tends to have in it. But not all good writing has it, but most good writing has it. That is the principle of resonance. So the principle of resonance. What is the principle of resonance? Well, the principle of resonance, first off, can be broken down into three different categories in most storytelling. But to start off, the principle of resonance is just how it sounds. It is very close to the actual dictionary definition. Something that resonates with the viewer, or something that leaves a lasting impact with the viewer, that can then be referred to in multiple stages of the storytelling. It can both change the storytelling, or the way in which the consumer is affected by the story, as well as change the story itself. It almost is a marker of progress for the story. Most good resonance really only has three different categories. The first category is emotional resonance, if a story has emotional resonance. The second category is if the story has narrative resonance. And the third category is if the story has thematic resonance. Okay. So I'm going to try to take you guys through. I have one good example, and the example kind of is an example for all three of them, which is not really what I wanted, because I was hoping to have three different examples so that people who don't know about resonance don't get confused. For the most part, creative writing classes and things of that nature tend not to talk about resonance in depth. They focus more on characters and story structure, things of that nature. In general, resonance is one of the things that most people will remember about a film, probably more than anything. So the reason as to why people tend to remember it more than anything is because of what are called, resonance points. Resonance points, colloquially, they are generally known as like setup versus payoff, right? So setup versus payoff points, but they go a little bit further than that. Okay, so a resonance point is essentially an anchor for the consumer, for the viewer or the listener within the story, for the consumer to go back to and to reference, where number one, they know that something important has happened. They've seen something important, they've heard something important, whatever it is, but also they know that that thing ultimately will lead to something that is a greater part of the story. It's not just that it's like a detail that that is a nice detail to know or to have about a character or about plot or anything like that, but that it is so important that without that particular point, the entire story could potentially change and or fall apart. Once you have a resonance point, you then have to generally have a reference resonance point, or in other words, think of it like skipping a rock across a pond. You have the initial impact point of the rock, and then you have the next impact point of the rock. So you refer back to the original thing that you did. And then you finally have the sinking point of the rock. And so what the sinking point of the rock is that the sinking point, when you look at it from like in a river, the sinking point generally makes the biggest circular ripple within the pond. And it brings pretty much everything that you've seen, everything that you've heard, everything that you've consumed, it brings it all the way back to the original point that was trying to be made by the writer. What you generally have is that most stories have one of three of those resonance points. Some of the most advanced stories or some of the better constructed stories tend to have all three of them, and they do it in a way in which is incredibly, it feels like it's super easy once they do it, but it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. So the example, so that we can really dig in here and me stop rambling, that I have right now is Iron Man in Marvel. So know and understand that for one, I am not in any way, shape, or form downing Marvel. Do I think that they are cinema? No. I've already addressed that in a previous video. I think that the argumentation of whether they are cinema or not and why they aren't, that to me is a completely moot point for various reasons. But I will say that they do have some fairly decent writing in some of the films that they have. The problem with me is that a lot of their films are too formulaic. That does not mean that they don't have some very advanced writing on display there. So the one resonance point that I can point to is that of Iron Man. So in the very first movie, the very first film to start the MCU, Iron Man, played by Robert Downey Jr., at the very end of the film, he literally comes out and says that he is Iron Man. And so what we've seen throughout that movie is that we have seen him go from someone who is incredibly arrogant and not self-sacrificing at all, really, to someone who at the very least learns that the thing he is most known for in the world, building weapons and selling weaponry around the world, is also the thing that nearly has gotten him killed. And it's the thing that's going to be both the death knell of him potentially and his legacy. It is the thing that he has been left by his father and that has also become his own legacy. It was essentially not his actual choice to, I guess, push into this area of expertise. Now, of course, we know that this in some ways mimics Robert Downey Jr.'s own life. He was a legacy. His father was an actor. I think his mother was also an actress, or she was at least involved in theater. So it was kind of destined for him to also become an actor. But when looking at his story, he goes through this journey, this whole journey, and it is supposed to be a journey that is somewhat humbling to him. But at the very end of the film, the fact that he has had multiple run-ins with death, he's almost died at least twice in the film, somehow does not change him fundamentally to become a better person. Instead, it has made him elevate himself and take his level of arrogance and expertise in a far different direction than what it might have if he had, I guess, if he had suffered even more than what he did. He has not necessarily changed on a fundamental level. Not yet. This essentially is them setting up an example of a narrative resonance point. Tony / Iron Man does not have to, he has gone through an entire film, and while he has dealt with the potential trappings of his own mortality and seeing that he could very well die and seeing that he does have shortcomings, he ultimately does not have to actually confront those shortcomings, nor does he have to fundamentally change his character in a way that will make the story completely different, that would change the story. In other words, he does not have to acknowledge that his arrogance could be a downfall, but that instead his arrogance has basically made him into the hero that he is. So he can be selfish, he can be arrogant. So in other words, Tony Stark realizes that while he does in fact have his flaws, he ultimately doesn't have to change in order to become a hero, in order to become the hero, in order to become Iron Man. This is the writers setting up a narrative resonance point, because when he ultimately does eventually change, or when you start to see him legitimately changing, you can refer back to that and see just how far he as a character has come. But through the entire film of Iron Man, he doesn't really make any sort of lasting changes at all. So like I said, you get a full-on glimpse at the start of a story that is clearly, even at the end of the film, clearly his story is not done, because he has so many more things to learn, so many more lessons that can be learned and gleaned from in a wiser manner. So then when you get finally to Endgame, to the final film in which he actually appears in, and he is about to die, the fact that, well, first off, let me backtrack. The secondary resonance point, or the checkpoint, so to speak, is in fact in one of the Avengers films, in which Captain America says that you are not the type of person to make the sacrifice play. He literally brings up not only what he perceives as a character flaw in Tony, but he brings up this idea that Stark still has a lot to learn about himself and a lot to learn about working with others, things of that nature. They basically allow him as a character to be stripped down by other characters within the story. This helps to build not only him as a character, but it helps to build his own individualized story, as well as the story in general, like the entirety of the story, because it specifically tells everybody where exactly he is in the story, where, like, what his importance is within the narrative. Again, if you're paying attention to it and you know resonance points, as soon as that line is uttered, you automatically know, like, oh, they're going to have to come back to that, because they're going to have to, as you guys say, pay it off. So you automatically know, or you should know, all the fans should have known, that Tony was going to have to die at some point in an Avengers film in order to make sure that the narrative resonance that was built in the first film, that was referenced in another film, and that ultimately does come true in Endgame, to make sure that those rocks, that rock skips across that pond and ultimately does get to its goal. Then you, of course, have Endgame, in which Tony does in fact make the sacrifice play, and he is the one who, with all of his arrogance, with all of everything that he's done, he realizes, unlike in Iron Man, where he has to sacrifice nothing to become the hero, he now has to sacrifice everything. Where in the first film, he was quite proud of the things that he had done, had a certain level of braggadociousness, of bravado to him, and he was like the big man on campus, being this larger than life figure that almost nobody in the world had ever seen or heard of before. He's like the first real superhero, so far as we know. Of course, the way the MCU changed things, retcon stuff, we don't really get into that. But he is, for the most part, the first hero out there, being that he feels a certain level of accomplishment there, and he feels a certain level of pride there. But once he gets to Endgame and he realizes that he is the one who is going to have to make the sacrifice play, he's the one who is going to have to die, he's the one who's ultimately still going to have to be the hero, the entirety of his story kind of changes there. Because what you realize is that it is not about him wanting to fulfill some sort of fantasy of being that guy, but rather it is really about him truly wanting to protect everybody. Now, yes, he says that multiple times throughout the series, the different films in the MCU, that he wants to protect people. He wants to protect people. He wants to protect people. Yet, many times, his actions are not counter to that, but they are, for a genius like himself, they are ill-placed and not very well thought out. So they do more harm than good, and you can see that he still has the same level of arrogance that he did in the cave, in which he felt like, well, obviously I'm going to get out of this because I'm the genius, and I'm ultimately going to have to be the hero. So you see that in Ultron, when he tried to do this thing and that ultimately failed. You see it again in Infinity War, when he takes off basically by himself. Doctor Strange, of course, is there. Spider-Man also hitches a ride, but he basically goes by himself because he thinks, oh, well, I can beat Thanos and become the ultimate hero. He realizes that no, ultimately he can't do that without the work of others, and he has to give up a certain level of his own arrogance, and by doing that, he fulfills the cycle. And you guys know what I'm saying when I say the cycle. He fulfills the cycle of his own narrative. So let me back up, because I didn't mention this at the very beginning. When you're talking about resonance points, generally what happens is that in stories, some of the best stories, their end is their beginning, which is their end. So essentially, you go back to the beginning once you get to the ending. And the journey, usually you go on like a journey in most stories, right? The journey that you have taken, everything will have changed, even though you get back to a point that seems like it's the same thing. That's what resonance is. It is a kind of looping storytelling. You can see now, it's harder to see the loop in narrative storytelling, but it's easier to see it in thematic and in emotional storytelling. Going back to emotional storytelling, we start over again with Iron Man, specifically in the first Iron Man at the very end. So again, Tony Stark at the very end of Iron Man, in a move that shocked, I believe, even Marvel fans at the time, he comes out in the movie and he says at the very end that yes, he is Iron Man. He announces to the world that he is not going to have a secret identity in this particular Marvel Cinematic Universe. And he proudly says that he is Iron Man. It is a declaration which, for a lot of people, especially for a lot of fans, when you first see him say that, it is an incredibly surprising thing. And also, weirdly enough, you as a viewer have most likely bought into his specific level and his specific type of bad boyism, bravado, certain je ne sais quoi that he has as Tony Stark and as Iron Man. Yes, he's arrogant, but you kind of like that he's arrogant. Yes, he's bold and he's brash, but again, you really kind of like that and you admire that. It's goes back to one of those boys want to be him, girls want to be with him type of things, to where it's like, you know that he's basically a jerk, but you kind of like that. And so then at the very end of the film, when he comes out and he does this move that you know is ultimately potentially going to put a target not just on his own back, but on the backs of literally everybody within his circle, you still cheer. Like, you still kind of cheer for him. You still sort of get a swell of excitement, because it's like, oh wow, he has done something that not only did I not expect it, but by doing what he did, he brought out a certain emotion in me of utter excitement, and there's a certain level of curiosity as to what exactly is going to happen next, right? So that is where emotional resonance starts. Not only does it create the emotional resonance point, but in announcing it the way that he announced it, it came off as being incredibly flippant. You realize then and there that yes, it's cool that he's Iron Man, but you realize that he himself has not considered just how important it is what he has created, just how important it is for him to be Iron Man. It is almost as if he's playing a game with this technology that he created. He doesn't seem to see that there is an incredible amount of responsibility that has come from his own genius. You fast forward through the series and there are other emotional resonance points that he hits over and over and over again. So then once you come to the end game and he's holding the glove and he says, I am Iron Man. This is after Thanos, of course, has said that he is inevitable. At that point, not only do you realize that he is going to die, just from having held on to all of that power in his one hand, that glove and the Infinity Stones that go with it are so immense that they definitely are going to kill him. But you also realize from an emotional standpoint, an emotional level, that he has finally come to realize just how important him being Iron Man is. And it is not something that he should have ever taken lightly or thought of essentially as a game or just this cool, nifty thing that he did one day in a cave, or over the course of a couple of weeks in a cave or in his garage. But it is something that has an immense amount of weight, and he realizes this only when he is about to die. This is not like the first time that he feels this sort of weight and responsibility, but it is the first and last time that he feels it to this extent, mainly because he has his own child now. That whole responsibility that he had to be Iron Man has switched up. It's changed. And so then you jump back and you see that one of the big checkpoints for his resonance point that others skip in the pond was in Iron Man 3, when he is being hailed as this big time superhero by this little boy. And this is probably why they decided to bring that little boy back as a teenager in Endgame, because it very much so marks a point to where he realizes, yes, he saved the world, and yes, that is incredibly important and all of that stuff. He realizes that he has become the kind of figure that he always thought his father was. He's a very complicated, complex individual, but that he actually has a certain level of importance in his own life, in his own story. It's not just one big giant party that he is living, and that he is living on the legacy of someone else, But no, he has now at this point created his own legacy, and his own legacy is tied into this suit that he has created, which has made him into a hero, which has made him into Iron Man. From the emotional standpoint, you go from, in the first film, all of the excitement and the wow of him actually announcing that, yeah, I am Iron Man, and doing it so flippantly, and yet also doing it to such applause. It goes from that to being a very emotional thing in the Avengers Endgame, mainly because, again, it's going to be the final thing that he says ever. And he's accepted the responsibility of that. The emotional journey that he takes to essentially accept himself, to not only accept himself, but to accept the entirety of himself, of him as a person, is just as rich as the other resonance of his narrative, of his narrative of growing into being this individual who isn't just made of bravado. So then we have the final resonance point, thematic resonance. Thematic resonance, for me, is probably one of the more important ones. Narrative resonance I like, but thematic and emotional resonance, for me, always have taken on, I guess, a bigger, more grander meaning. In general, especially when you're creating art and not just entertainment, although entertainment has it as well, the theme of something is incredibly important to remember because it kind of bolsters the entirety of the story, and it helps to mold the emotional points, the emotional resonance, as well as the narrative. It sort of becomes, I guess, a guiding light, so to speak. We start with Tony Stark being essentially somewhat of a shell, okay? And let me be very clear. Most big-time stories can have a bunch of different things. Generally, a well-written story should have at least 2 different themes going at any one time. A lot of them can have 3 themes, and if it's going to be a really well-written story or is trying to be on a great level, it probably should have somewhere around 5 themes. So some of my books actually have 5 themes. They're part of what I would call the master series, in which it's not that I'm saying I'm a master at writing. I'm not, but it is saying that this is basically the greatest bit of writing that I can give you on a particular subject or in a particular genre. Okay, so I'm just going to go with the theme of who Tony Stark is as a man. When we first start out with Tony Stark is, for all intents and purposes, a fairly fragile shell of a person, of an individual. He is someone who is a drunk. He's an alcoholic. He has father issues because even though he doesn't say it outright, at least I don't think he does. He might say it outright sometimes. We know that he is struggling with the idea of living up to his father's very larger than life status. He feels in some ways like he is still within his father's shadow. So he uses all of his arrogance and his sarcasm and even his money and his intelligence. He actually uses those as shields, not just to protect himself from getting too close with people, right? He's like a 40-something-year-old bachelor who's never been married. He is kind of, for all intents and purposes, he is what I think they sometimes refer to online as somewhat of a soy boy, even though he's a soy boy in like an F-boy's body, okay? And so he has all the money and the wealth and all that stuff, but he is very fragile as a person, as a human being. He is very much so trying to compensate or overcompensate for the things that he feels he is lacking. He feels that he can't live up to his father's standard. For whatever reason, there are things that bother him that he can't control. The biggest thing that he has in his life is the ability to control almost everything. So whenever he comes to a problem that he feels he can't control, either with his money or with his status, he can put on this suit of iron and control it physically. So what happens is that he continues to run into problems that are essentially greater than him and that he still can't defeat. He can't control these things. He's always seeing his own flaws reflected back at him. Because of the fact that he's seeing his flaws reflected back at him, he always feels that there's something that he can't fully, I guess, accomplish, or in other words, there's something that he's unable to complete. It is because of his own internalized fragility. He, in some ways, feels like a failure, regardless of how successful he oftentimes is. In some ways, he is looking for, I guess, a rubric by which to compare himself to in order to truly gauge whether he is being successful or not. Throughout the first 3 Iron Men, he's constantly comparing himself to his father because he doesn't have really any other gauge by which to tell if what he is doing is good or is being done well. What's interesting here is that one could, through the 3 Iron Mans, if you're not truly aware of the resonance, one could potentially mistake his fragility and his desire to do better as him dealing with his own mortality. Because again, until he gets the shrapnel and then the reactor removed from his chest, he still is suffering from that shrapnel slowly moving toward his heart, which ultimately would kill him. However, I'm not going to say that that's a wrong interpretation, but it is an interpretation that doesn't consider all of the other emotional impacts that he himself is dealing with. He is more concerned with building something that can make him feel no longer like he is in his father's shadow, and also like he is no longer a failure regardless of how successful he becomes. But ultimately, Tony's thematic journey goes along the lines that he must find a certain level of inner strength to defeat the ideas that he is not enough, that he is not good enough, and that the things that he does, the flaws that he has, are flaws that are essentially insurmountable. You see this in Captain America Civil War specifically. Tony Stark jumps at the idea of being, for lack of a better word, corralled and collared by the world governments in order to not have or not bear the responsibility of being Iron Man anymore. That is not to say that he wouldn't still wear the suit. He most certainly would still wear the suit, but rather the idea to him of being Iron Man requires a certain level of strength as well as a certain level of introspection that he is still not ready fully to give or to engage in himself. All throughout the series, you see him both trying to break away from his father while at the same time not fully wanting a certain level of responsibility when it comes to Avengers, when it comes to defending the world, and yet at the same time also trying to solve those very problems that he doesn't actually want the responsibility of solving. His mentality is a hypocrisy. He's trying to do everything himself, but he also really doesn't want to do everything himself. Therein lies the weaknesses and the fragility. His weaknesses are making him fragile in a way in which he's getting anxiety. And yes, his anxiety partially comes from the fact that he almost died in New York in the first Avengers, but it more so comes from the fact that he feels that there is the literal weight of the world on his shoulders, and he really doesn't know if he can handle that. He does not know if he has matured enough, or if he is strong enough, or if he is, for lack of a better term, man enough to become the hero that he thinks that he is, or to become the hero that he knows he can be. It really isn't until Endgame, and not just Endgame, but the 5 years later, and even, I would say, into the time travel, when he runs into his own father, and he tries to talk to his father about, having children and things of that nature. And obviously he's talking really about himself and how his father tried to parent. In Captain America Civil War, he deals with the things left over from his mother. And then in Endgame, he deals with things left over from his father. And again, the conversation, obviously, in Endgame seems to have nothing to do with him being Iron Man, right? But he realizes something that his father probably would have been able to tell him once he was an adult, but that he never was able to hear. And that is essentially that he is ultimately enough as a person, and he is enough as himself. So whatever sorts of questions that he may have about the things that he's going to do, he shouldn't question himself in nearly the kind of ways that he has been doing. He shouldn't beat himself up in the same way that he has been doing, but that instead, by conquering all the things that he has done, by conquering his anxiety issues, by conquering his drinking, by even conquering his lecherousness, right, with women, he has made himself into the man that his father probably always knew he could be. And thusly, when he finally goes to at the very end and he grabs the glove and he says, "I am Iron Man," the last words also mean, as they in the other resonance loops, the other resonance circles, the words there also then mean that it is not just that he has the suit or that he wears the suit, but that he has expelled from himself all of the weaknesses that previously made him a lesser hero, which is exactly what Captain America, Steve Rogers, is exactly what Steve saw and identified in him almost immediately. He has expelled those things from himself. He's expelled those weaknesses. He is no longer fragile, but that he has in fact become an Iron Man. The things that he thought about himself can no longer hurt him because he is much stronger than he's ever been before. I feel like that one makes the most sense out of the three that I've described here. I'm sorry guys, I don't know what's going on. My brain feels very fuzzy today, and so I was trying to get these out, and I have some notes here, but I don't know what's going on, man. I really don't. But yeah, in any case, those are the different resonance points. The resonance points, they're good because they are very circular in their notion. So again, you start with one particular kind of idea, and you go around, and about halfway through the idea has changed drastically. It seems like it's the complete opposite of what the original idea was, only to then get all the way back to that very idea. In Iron Man, at the very beginning of a film, you see a man who thinks himself strong, but he's the straw man strong. He's the straw type of strong man, right? Because he has all the money and the wealth and the power, and more importantly, because he makes weapons of mass destruction, he thinks he's strong, only to then, at the very end, make himself actually strong. And it's not that he needs weapons to be strong, but that all he needed to truly be strong, to have true strength, is belief essentially in himself, above and beyond the all of the other accoutrements that come with having been this superhero. Same thing goes for the emotional resonance. Again, we go from this happy moment of elation to this incredibly sad moment of weeping, even though we also know that he fulfilled the one job that he wanted to fulfill, is that he truly did become the superhero he thought he always could become. And then of course the narrative resonance, right? So we go on his journey of self-discovery with him throughout the whole thing, and we see how he changes, we see how he matures. Even though he's already a middle-aged man when all of this starts, he still somehow has a lot to learn, a lot to mature in, and just a lot to do as a person. So I hope that was good. I don't know, man. This is another reason why I'm always down on myself with these videos, because it always feels like no matter how many notes I write or anything like that, I've always felt like I was a better improvisational person, right? To where it's like I could just talk to somebody and improv off of them. But now more than ever, it seems like I am super improvisational. And so it's like I write these notes and then I just kind of forget how I want to link them all together. So maybe I'll use a script in one. I don't know. We'll see. But emotional resonance, thematic resonance, and narrative resonance are three things that ultimately almost all good or great writing has. And if you don't have that, then that's when you have a problem. The show that shall not be named, that show tries to have it, but oh god, it just fumbles the ball so many different times. It fails to create the emotional resonance points that it really should have or really should need. It fails to create essentially a loop. I'll talk a bit more about that in another video, maybe. But right now, so while I don't have an official sign off yet, I guess I should do the whole please like, comment, share, and if you so desire and you want to see more, subscribe. But more importantly, I will ask that you please go and purchase one of my books. They are mostly ebooks, and pretty much they are all under $10. See if any of my work is actually any good, if it lives up to any of the things that I'm talking about here on my channel, specifically with the entertainment industry videos. So please go purchase my books. All of my links are down below. Thank you.